I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello once again, David.
Good morning.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Ralph, I understand you've produced something new. What do you have for us?
Well, I've produced a doorstop. You know, people need doorstops. And it also has another purpose. It's a collection of my columns over the last decade. It's called Out of Darkness, Essays on Corporate Power and Civic Resistance, 725 pages, and it summarizes and reflects a lot of what listeners have heard over the few years on our program and more. Very, very selected essays, each one of them about 800 or 1,000 words, and I commend it to your listeners, to libraries, to the children or relatives of your listeners. It gives them a great start in the way I think democracy and civic participation in power should be thinking and working for.
And coming out of the darkness.
Coming out of the darkness. And, you know, when you're not reading it, it's a great doorstop.
So it's got a dual purpose. Excellent.
I need a door. I have the book. Now I need a door.
Yes, you're like, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps because you have no boots.
Can I use it to weigh myself down during a tornado?
Yes, I believe you could. First on today's program, we're going to revisit the public health crisis in Gaza. We've previously covered the severe undercount of the death toll in Gaza since October 7th. In official circles, it totals less than 40,000. But according to a latest report from the medical journal The Lancet, at minimum, it should be closer to 186,000. Why is that undercount so important? Our first guest today will be Dr. Thaer Ahmad, a Palestinian American doctor who has spent time on the ground during the ongoing genocidal bombardment of the Gaza Strip. He will speak to us about his personal experience trying to treat patients while they're being actively displaced and their medical infrastructure is being blown to smithereens. Next, we turn our gaze back to the domestic front. On July 1st, the Supreme Court wrapped up a very busy term, trying to turn America into a monarchy with their decision on presidential immunity. Noted constitutional scholar Keel Reed Amar called it, quote, one of the worst decisions in all of constitutional history, making the Constitution itself unconstitutional, unquote. In her blistering dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, the relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law, end quote. She closed with the admonition, with fear for our democracy, I dissent. We've invited our very own constitutional scholar Bruce Fein to give us a more detailed take on the Supreme Court's latest folly. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our incorruptible corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear from a doctor who is an eyewitness to genocide. David?
Dr. Thaer Ahmad is a Palestinian American emergency physician who has made numerous relief trips to Gaza. Dr. Ahmad is assistant program director for the Emergency Medicine Residency Program at Chicago's Advocate Christ Medical Center. He also serves as the Global Health Director and Medical Ethics Director for the Emergency Department at Advocate Christ. Dr. Ahmad is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago and a board member for Med Global, a medical humanitarian NGO that works at building healthcare capacity and reducing health inequities globally. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Thaer Ahmad.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome indeed, Dr. Ahmad. Just by way of laying the predicate here for our discussion, while we're recording this program, the news from Gaza is that the Israeli terror machine led by Netanyahu has blown up 4 schools in 4 days, full of children, women, and teachers trying to huddle and shelter. Body parts, according to the press reports, were flying in all directions. Critically injured survivors have nowhere to go. There are no health care services in that area. At the same time, The Netanyahu genocide drive has ordered once again an evacuation of northern Gaza. These people have been ordered again and again to leave, and there's nowhere to go. And they're attacked as they're fleeing by Israeli snipers and artillery. Now, what we've seen is there is a decline in media attention in the United States. The thousands of humanitarian aid trucks, which used to be a daily story, are no longer a daily story. The slaughter in Gaza is getting off the front pages. The focus is on Biden and whether he is physically and mentally fit to run for re-election. Now, with that, you have come back from Gaza, and you've read the Lancet report by 3 researchers in the prestigious British Medical Journal, and they took the most minimal conservative estimate of 186,000 dead so far in Gaza, and they added the phrase, or even more. Can we get your appraisal of this? When you were over there, is it fair to say that there's probably very few people in Gaza who have survived who are not sick, injured, or both? Can you give us your appraisal as a physician who's been over there?
I mean, I think every single person that's been on the ground in the Gaza Strip agrees that the estimate that we are hearing that's coming out from the Gaza Strip, from right now, it's coming out of the government media office, is a severe undercount. I mean, of course, it does not include the tens of thousands that may be trapped beneath the rubble, who are gone missing, unidentified, of course, as a result of the intense bombing. And that's just from these direct attacks that we're talking about. We know that the healthcare infrastructure in Gaza has been devastated. I saw that firsthand. I was in Khan Yunis when Nasser Hospital, which is the second largest hospital in the Gaza Strip, was surrounded, was raided, was rendered defunct and destroyed. And so you understand that if the second largest hospital, which is Nasser, and the first largest hospital, which is Shifa, which capacity, we're regularly supposed to be able to handle an area where there are hundreds of thousands of people, if those are rendered defunct and you're not able to provide healthcare, you're not able to receive the injured or the sick, then you know that there's going to be this thing called excess mortality. You know that there's going to be people who are going to be dying unnecessarily. And I think what the Lancet talks about, and what you brought up, which is such an important point here, is that it's not just about the 2,000 pound bombs that are wreaking havoc and leveling neighborhoods. It's not just about the tank shelling. It's not just about the gunshots that are being fired. It's this idea of indirect deaths. And that's what the Lancet touched on. That's what John Hopkins and the London School of Hygiene, when they did their report back in February and when they updated it again recently, that's what your estimates are talking about. That's what Susan Abu Hawa, her estimates also talk about. People are saying that there is a consideration beyond the exact traumatic deaths that'll be coming in. It's beyond just the bombs that are dropping. It's this idea that this humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place is going to lead to immense suffering and an incredible amount of death. And you touched on such really important points that I saw firsthand on the ground in every single NGO, UN body that's on the ground in Gaza is saying the same thing. There are not enough items of food that are entering into the Gaza Strip. And then you want to take it to a step further. There's not even all of the food groups that are entering into the Gaza Strip. We have a limited amount of food that's getting to people who are hungry, and it's causing a rise in malnutrition. And God forbid, if you get sick or you get injured and you are malnourished, your likelihood of dying as a result of the common cold, as a result of a diarrheal illness, or as a result of maybe a wound or shrapnel injury goes up exponentially. Every single healthcare provider knows that. And then in addition to that, we keep displacing Palestinians, moving them around like sheep in the Gaza Strip from north to south to central. And right now, there's an evacuation order in Gaza City for every single civilian. All of Gaza City. Gaza City is the biggest city in Gaza. There's probably more than 250,000 people there. Where are they supposed to go, and what kind of effects does that have if these people decide to flee and go somewhere to maybe central Gaza, where there are already over 1.5 million people there? There's not enough food. There isn't any clean water that's available for people. These are all public health disasters that are compounded by the active military campaign that's going on. And it's exactly why people are very concerned about the numbers the actual numbers that are there. And we know that it's astronomically high. We know that this is something that's, going to be really horrendous once the dust settles and we have access and we are able to try to get a more accurate estimate. We know it's going to be much, much higher. And then the last thing I'll mention too, with respect to this, that I think people would be interested in hearing about this is, if you start to look at the scale of the destruction, we know that we say 70% of civilian infrastructure has been destroyed, or residential homes have been damaged or destroyed. We know that 60% of the agricultural lands that would produce a lot of the food has been destroyed because of the intensity of the bombs that have been dropped. We know that the water infrastructure, so whether it's the desalination plant or it's the filters or the ability to filter the water, has been damaged or destroyed. A large, vast majority of that has been damaged or destroyed. Just all of these things together, not excluding, any sort of epidemic or pandemic of any sort of diseases. This puts the entire population at risk. And then I want you to start thinking about the fact that just because there's a war going on doesn't mean that the natural health stuff doesn't occur, that people still don't get cancer, that kids still don't get sick or are born with congenital abnormalities, that pregnant women still don't have complications. All of those things are still happening. But those people are at risk of dying. Whereas in normal situations, if a healthcare system was actually functioning, you could save their lives. But now if a woman has bleeding after she's delivering a baby or giving birth, there is a real chance, so it's a coin toss of whether or not she'll be able to survive that complication. Because out of the 36 hospitals that used to function prior to October, we know that probably 9 of them have their doors open and maybe have their lights on. And even those hospitals aren't functioning at their full capacity. So any which way you look at it, 360 degrees, the people in the Gaza Strip are suffering immensely and all lifelines have been cut off from them.
And it's even worse. It's hard to, find the words for it. U.S. reporters are banned from going into Gaza, as well as Israeli reporters and reporters from other countries under orders of Netanyahu. And it's banned the kind of reporting that would get back to the American people. Joe Biden is not troubled by that at all. The State Department and AID have far more information about the wreckage, the physical wreckage, the human toll, than they are disclosing. When the Assistant Secretary of State in November testified before Congress, she blurted out that the Hamas figures were quite probably an undercount and that the fatalities are much greater. They muzzled her. She never was able to talk publicly again. So there's a cover-up of the deaths. That's how grisly, that's how cruel, vicious, savage our co-belligerency is supporting Netanyahu's regime. The New York Times on June 18th had an article called "Doctors Stunned by Sheer Number of Amputations in Gaza." Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, who is a world-renowned trauma surgeon, publishes on war injuries, has several times suggested that we have the largest cohort of child amputees in the Gaza Strip. And this is something that many of these articles have also touched on with respect to increased death toll. That, if you have about 50% of your population children and they have been displaced along with their families, and they're sheltering in these urban areas that are subject to intense bombing campaigns, this is something that you'd expect. You expect for there to be a lot of children who die. And then the second part of this is to sustain these life-disabling injuries. And so that's something that's every single person that goes into the Gaza Strip, whether they're in the north or in the south or in central Gaza, that's something they saw firsthand. They are watching children have their limbs blown away, and they are watching a healthcare system that's not able to treat those patients. There is no way for a child to get a prosthetic in the Gaza Strip. There are no rehabilitation facilities, and that increases also their mortality. And the other thing that I also wanted to mention is, you may have heard, but the United States has announced that they're going to disassemble this pier permanently. Probably $300 million pier that was supposed to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip, especially after famine-like conditions were met long ago in North Gaza. And now it's all of Gaza, really, with respect to famine-like conditions. I'd expect that the children that we're talking about who may have suffered a wound or an amputation or a result of this, if now we have a landlock with respect to humanitarian aid getting in, and then the U.S. has failed totally in its ability to deliver aid because of their pier. And we know that the amount of trucks that are getting in every single day for whatever reason is going down. And you hear groups like Oxfam and Amnesty start saying that starvation is being used as a weapon. What happens to those kids who suffered these injuries? We are putting them at major risk. You're not allowing them to recover. And the kids who have somehow survived miraculously during this, these last 9 months, the fact that we are causing this degree of famine to take place, those kids, if they survive this, are going to be irreversibly harmed as a result of this. Their physical and mental development, all of it is going to be affected. We're talking about higher rates of non-communicable diseases that we'll see in the future. This entire generation of children in the Gaza Strip are going to have negative health effects as a result of what's taking place. And so, this is something that's really concerning because there's no way for kids to be treated in the Gaza Strip who are suffering these war injuries. They lose a limb. There's no way for them to be treated. But it's virtually impossible to get medical evacuations out. The World Health Organization is saying we have between 12 and 14,000 people in Gaza who need to be urgently evacuated. And since May 6th, when the Israelis, May 6th, May 7th, when they stormed the Rafah border between Palestine and Egypt, between Gaza and Egypt, and that border was shut down, there has only been one day where we have been able to get medical evacuations out, about 60 people. And that you're talking about, we've approached 2 months now. And it's not, again, we're talking about people who've been injured in the war, kids who've lost limbs, but also kids with cancer who need chemotherapy, people who have kidney failure and need dialysis. All those people will die waiting to get out. All of those people who are on this list will die, and they're not going to be included in an official number. And that's why it's really important to address that and recognize that there are people who are silently dying in these indirect deaths. That's what the Lancet is talking about. And we need to make sure that we recognize that because this has got to stop. And, it's really horrifying.
There are 45,000 babies that have been born since October in Gaza. What has happened to them? 45,000 babies, no mother nutrition, no clean water, poisoned water, contaminated air, no health care. How could they possibly survive?
The other thing is that there is, and I saw this firsthand, there are maybe 1,000, 2,000 trucks of aid that's sitting outside of the Rafah border in Egypt. And we know several of those trucks have infant formula for these kids that you're talking about that are being born, this at-risk population, especially if they are under 6 months. We know that they are at high risk and that we know that there's been a rise in the rate of anemia in pregnant women, which means that their kids are also at risk. The other thing is these are all things that we know is taking place. And you kind of touched on this as well. Right now, the conditions in Gaza right now, with respect to how the temperatures are so high and scorching, and there are all these makeshift tents, they're not proper tents. We know that there's going to be these vulnerable populations, elderly, young children, people who are malnourished, that are going to be suffering. And a lot of them, unfortunately, are not going to survive. And so, this is really such a tragic situation in Gaza right now because the media coverage has sort of kind of fallen off. And it seems to be getting particularly horrifying in the schools that have been hit. I mean, these schools are not schools anymore. They are shelters, and they are sheltering mostly women and children because the men are expected to kind of fend for themselves in Gaza, find areas where they can sleep. But, the idea that a school is being hit, you just know that it's totally crowded with people. I mean, UNRWA was telling us that their shelters were 8 times over capacity. And so you can imagine that some of these classrooms have 30, 40 people just sheltering inside of them. And to hear that it's school after school and hospital after hospital being hit, and the healthcare system is already collapsed, how do we expect any of these people to survive these injuries? Yeah, they may be able to be alive for several hours, several days, or several weeks after being injured, but we're basically sentencing them to death if we don't have some sort of stop to this.
Well, the American people see the images on social media, once in a while on mainstream media. They don't hear the screams of anguish. They don't hear the dying groans. They don't smell the smell of corpses. They don't see the real situation over there that is beyond description.
Yeah.
So in December, the head of the Global Health Department of the University of Edinburgh estimated 500,000 Gazans would die in 2024 if things don't change. Well, things have gotten even worse, and we're still reporting 38,000 deaths. What do you think the American people should say to their Congress and to the president?
I think, there's a couple of things that I would really want to highlight about that. Prime Minister Netanyahu is somebody that the International Criminal Court wants to issue arrest warrants for. He's somebody that has deliberately undermined our policy, our interests in the region at whole, not just limited to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is somebody that is undermining all of that. And in addition to that, he's somebody that when it comes to us supporting humanitarian efforts or us trying to get some sort of ceasefire, this is somebody that has been an obstacle every step of the way, has sabotaged it. And you're talking about somebody who has every interest to propagate and prolong this war and expand it in the region. This is somebody whose political life depends on the fact that the country needs to stay at war. And yet we're rolling out the red carpet for this person. And one of the people that signed the letter inviting him, Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer, is the same person that weeks prior to that letter signing it and inviting him was saying he needs to be fired. He needs to be removed as the prime minister. So it's really embarrassing right now with respect to our country and the positions that we're taking and the way that we're just sort of tiptoeing around this maniac, this insane sort of person that's insisting on increasing the pain in Gaza as much as possible, that's contributing to the worst humanitarian crisis we've seen since World War II. And as you mentioned, these numbers that we're hearing right now are nowhere near accurate. And it's clear to every single person that has any bit of knowledge of what's taking place on the ground in Gaza that once there is some sort of ceasefire and the situation stabilizes and there is access of foreign correspondence and people are able to move about freely in the Gaza Strip without worried about being blown away from the sky, there's going to be a reckoning there, and the numbers that we're going to see are going to horrify everybody, and the degree of destruction and damage, it's going to be devastating. There's a couple of things. You mentioned UNRWA, for example. I don't think the American people understand that UNRWA in this region essentially functions like a quasi-government. They're the second largest healthcare provider in the Gaza Strip, only after the Ministry of Health. They employed the most people in the Gaza Strip, 13,000 people. They employ 30,000 people in this region and they're all Palestinians that they're employing. They also function with respect to education and delivery of aid. We know all of that. And we know that the annual contribution that the U.S. gives to UNRWA, which does this incredible work, that has the infrastructure in place to be able to deliver aid, knows where all the vulnerable populations are, that we know that it's between $200 and $300 million annually. Well, we just threw away all of this money for this pier that never did what it was supposed to do. We just totally threw it away. And any single time the waves were really rocky in the Mediterranean Sea, it just blew away this pier that the U.S. constructed. So I would say that we need to really come to grips with what we're doing in the Middle East, especially when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because what we've been doing for the last 6 decades has not worked at all. And it's only led to this horrible situation that we're in now.
Well, 16 leading Israeli human rights groups know what the score is. They put a letter to Biden on December 13th, printed in the New York Times, calling him out for allowing a catastrophe, as they put it, in Gaza. And the rest of the press didn't cover it. 16 major Israeli human rights groups led by B'Tselem, involving rabbis for human rights, the refusnik soldiers who don't want to have any part of destroying the West Bank and Gaza. And that didn't break through. But you had a meeting with Joe Biden in the White House. Tell us about that.
So, during Ramadan, and this was right after the great people of Michigan decided to do a protest vote during the primary, and there was the uncommitted vote campaign that I think really kind of rattled some people in the White House. And during Ramadan, they usually do an iftar where they kind of break the fast, and it's a big event, and it's supposed to be a celebratory time. Instead, the White House acknowledged that people were very upset and angry about what was taking place in Gaza and wanted to essentially do this sort of closed, I would say a smaller meeting with people who had been on the ground. And I was invited as a Palestinian American who had been on the ground. But I had felt that leading up to it, that there were really some red flags. First, there was what happened to the 7 workers for World Central Kitchen, where there was a triple tap by the Israeli military, hitting their convoy, despite them coordinating with the Israelis, telling them that they had left the location where they were at, where they were headed, what road they were going to take, who was in these vehicles. Despite all of that, there were 3 missiles that hit their convoys, killing all of them. There was also the approval of fighter jet sales. And then there was also the transfer, the State Department transfer of more bombs, more ammunition to the Israelis, all while this was taking place. And so I had felt that this was not actually going to be a serious encounter or serious meeting. And I was really concerned that I would be a token Palestinian and that this was more for the campaign as opposed to policy and the humanitarian crisis in a serious kind of meeting. So, all of these things leading up to the meeting prompted me to realize that I can't participate in this meeting, but I did want to make a statement. I did want to make sure that the president and the national security advisor and the vice president and the ambassador to the United Nations, that they understood where we were coming from and how upset we were. I wanted to be able to just look at all of them in the eye and be able to say, because of our policy and what has transpired at that time over the last 6 months, I'm going to protest this meeting. I'm going to get up. I'm going to walk away. And, as somebody who was in Gaza, and I've been in Gaza prior to this war, and I've been there during the war, and I've really seen the devastation that took place, I couldn't reasonably live with myself and sit there without kind of making that protest and trying to communicate that message to them. And I did. At that time, there was a lot of talk about Rafah invasion. And we were screaming at the top of our lungs, all of the NGOs, every single person that saw what Rafah looked like at the time, the southernmost part of the Gaza Strip where everybody was told to flee to. We were saying, under no circumstance can there be an invasion of Rafah. It would be catastrophic. It would be disastrous. And I even gave the president a letter from an orphan who was in Rafah, an 8-year-old whose name is Hadid. And of course, nothing happened. There was no red line that was enforced, as we had heard from the White House that, Rafah invasion would be a red line. There was the tent massacre that took place. There was an absolute slaughter. It was a bloodbath. They were deep in the humanitarian crisis. People were fleeing all over. And, it sucks to have to sit here and say, this is what we were talking about. We were right about it. And you guys allowed it to happen. You allowed the Israelis to sort of destroy it and also, deepen an already tragic humanitarian crisis, make it even worse. And it's all man-made. And that's really the struggle.
And weeks before your meeting with Joe Biden in the White House, Dr. Joe Biden saw some of the slaughter in videos over there. That was December, and told Joe the following: stop it now, Joe. That was her exact quote. Let's go to Steve.
Dr. Ahmad, to take this a little bit out of the realm of abstraction, since you are there and can give us an eyewitness account, tell us a story or an anecdote about a personal experience you had on the ground there while you were in Gaza during the war.
Well, there's 2 things that I think really capture the story of what a typical Palestinian who's living in Gaza is going through. And the first is, I do want to mention a family that I came into contact with and that I actually brought back here to the United States with me, who was in Gaza. This is a family of 6 who had heard loud noises around their house when they had presumed that it was bombing. And they decided to flee their house in a hurry. And as they rushed outside and were trying to flee to the nearest hospital or shelter that they could run into, they were hit with a bomb. And they're not sure if it was from a tank or from a fighter jet or from a drone. They don't know what it was. And in that process, this family of 6, their 18-month-old son was killed. Their 11-year-old daughter was killed. The father lost both of his legs. The mother was sprayed with shrapnel. The 5-year-old daughter, whose name is Mayar, was hit in the leg and caused this horrific injury, breaking many of the bones in her legs. And Amina, their other daughter, who survived as well, who is 8, had some minor injuries. So they go to Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital. And that's where they're getting some treatment there. The father is basically, who's now a double amputee, is getting treated there. Mayar, the 5-year-old who broke so many bones in her leg, they start to do different operations to try to help her out. While they are recovering in this hospital, and this is in late December, days after first arriving and kind of dealing with this tragic scenario, the Israeli military surrounds the hospital. And the entire hospital is forced to evacuate. And this just happened again, by the way, to the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in northern Gaza. It was again under evacuation orders just a day ago. So they start walking. The mom and the 11-year-old start walking. The father, who's a double amputee, is in a chair. And then they're carrying the 5-year-old who just came out of surgery for these horrifying wounds. And they have to walk miles to the south. And they're walking and they get to a checkpoint in the middle of the Gaza Strip over the Wadi Gaza River, where there's an Israeli military checkpoint that's there. And the mom is telling me that they're forced to take all of their clothes off and all of the possessions that they have, the very few things that they were able to grab from their house, and they have to hand it over to the Israeli military. They said that she had 300 shekels, which is the equivalent of $100 that they even had to hand over. That was everything that to their name. They had to hand it over. And then they were told, go, just keep going south. So they finally make it to Rafah. They find a shelter for her husband, and then they take their daughter to a local hospital that's there. And as she's recovering, they get in contact with an NGO, and they're able to get Mayar, this 5-year-old, on a list to be evacuated out of the Gaza Strip to Egypt. And she gets evacuated to Egypt with her mom and her 8-year-old sister. The dad has to stay back because men are not going to be evacuated. They're never going to be approved. So they're in Cairo, and they get into contact with different groups here in the United States. And then they're able, because of Senator Jeff Merkley, that gets elevated, and they get this approval. And they get to come here to the United States. And I was supposed to be their medical escort. So I get to meet them. I'm talking to them. I go to the Cairo airport with them. It was the first time they had ever seen a plane that was not a fighter jet. It was the first time that they had ever left the Gaza Strip and they had been able to leave Egypt. I remember we landed in Newark Airport and they were asking me, looking at the gates and looking at all of the other planes. They're saying, are we in America? I said, yeah, this is America. They said, wow, it's so big. And they were shocked. They were just watching all of the planes take off, looking at all of the different restaurants, seeing that they can plug in, if they had a phone or a tablet, they'd be able to plug it in anywhere they wanted to. There's a bathroom with many stalls and running water. And unfortunately, this is one story of a family that suffered tremendous loss, that had to be separated. They're now in the United States. The dad is still in Rafah. They try to talk to each other every now and then whenever telecommunications are restored. Mayar, this 5-year-old, is unfortunately going to have to lose her leg because of this injury, and she's going to get a prosthetic. So she is going to forever have the imprint of what's taken place in this war. The entire family has been traumatized. Their mental health is a serious issue that almost all of the Gaza Strip has been exposed to. And they are in this position, and they are one family of what I am sure is tens of thousands of families that have similar stories. And what happens after Maya gets her treatment? I mean, where is she going to go? They don't want to stay in the United States. They want to go back to Gaza. But what will be left of Gaza for them to go back? They want to be reunited with their father. They want to see him. They want to be able to go back to school. So, for me, that story really encompasses what we're talking about when we say, this is a humanitarian crisis. It's not just about the numbers of people who've been killed. It's about the fact that people's lives have been flipped upside down, and it seems to be that it's in an irreversible way, whether it's a physical injury, mental health, whether it's your livelihood, what dreams you had, all of that has been flipped on its head in the Gaza Strip. The last thing I'll say is, as a physician, obviously having been on the ground, I work in the south side of Chicago. So where I work is a trauma center, a level 1 trauma center. We're no strangers to trauma. But every single person that I've spoken to who has gone to the Gaza Strip and worked in these scenarios, we all come back horrified by what we've seen. And, be interacting with the Palestinian healthcare workers, I don't think they get enough credit for what they've had to deal with over these last several months. The doctors I worked with, the ICU doctor, Dr. Mahmoud, Dr. Ahmad, Dr. Jamal, these doctors are also displaced. Their families are displaced. They are living out of tents, and they are showing up every day to the hospital to treat the community that's there. They've not been paid. I mean, the health ministry collapsed. They have no money. They're totally dependent on the scarce aid that gets in. These doctors are showing up to work when they should be in line at the bakeries that are producing some of the bread, where they should be in line collecting some of the aid that's being distributed. But they're showing up. And we're having them go to these hospitals that have become targets, that get raided, where people get abducted and arrested. 500 healthcare workers have been killed. 220 have been detained. And they still show up. They're not being paid. They don't have the medicines, the equipment, the tools that they need. They're treating people on the floor. They are watching their society be ripped apart. And they do it with such incredible grace. And they're saving an incredible amount of lives. And they are absolute heroes. And they get no credit for it. And I got to experience and work alongside these people. If it wasn't for them, I would have been no use when I was in the Gaza Strip. They literally would hold my hand and be able to guide me through some of these horrifying moments when I'm watching families come through. One night that really sticks out is having to see a whole family come through after being bombed and pronouncing 4 of their daughters dead, just lifeless. And those moments I'm not prepared to deal with. But again, I had to lean on my colleagues, the Palestinian healthcare workers that are there. So I really wanted to just kind of bring them up and shout them out because what they're doing is no short of incredible.
Well, it's worse than that. The doctors and healthcare workers are themselves sick or injured,
Absolutely.
mentally traumatized, barely able to get enough food to go to work every day. They are victims themselves. And
Absolutely.
hundreds of them have been killed, as you say, by the Israelis in the process of blowing up 150 healthcare facilities and destroying most of the hospitals in the Gaza Strip. David?
Doctor, could you describe what healthcare was like in Gaza before October 7th and the role Egypt and Israel played in that?
Absolutely. I mean, this is well documented. I mean, this is something that I particularly talk about and lecture on. There's this notion of medical apartheid, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip really had a tough time sort of building and growing their healthcare infrastructure despite the population growing. The bottom line is since 2006, the Israeli military imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip, and Egypt was all along for the ride, happy to sort of enforce this blockade, meaning that people are not able to freely pass out of the Gaza Strip, but also items entering into the Gaza Strip was really hard. And a lot of the work that I did was mainly trying to increase the capacity of the local healthcare workers and allow them to be able to grow and develop. One thing that's important to know is that if you look at mortality rates in Gaza and the West Bank compared to Israel, every single item you look at, it's much higher in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And I'm talking about things like heart disease. I'm talking about cancer. I'm talking about pediatric illnesses. We are talking about 2 to 3 times higher mortality rates in Palestine compared to Israel, your next door neighbor. And I'll give some very...
This is before October 7th. This is before
October 7th. Absolutely, before October 7th. So it really kind of gives you an idea what the conditions looked like. We are talking about a system in Palestine where 30% of the budget for the health ministry is about getting people out of Palestine to other areas to get treatment. That's how severe this blockade is. One thing I'll mention just to kind of make it, clear cut, there's a list that the WHO produces, and it's about essential medicines. Think about things like penicillin, amoxicillin. Think about, what you would use in terms of fluids or anesthesia medicines. And what it says, the WHO says, for every country, this is an essential medicine, and it needs to be present in your inventory in your central drug supply. If you look at the United States and you look at Israel, this number is above 99% any given time. Before October 7th, in Gaza, the availability of these essential medicines was 55%. So imagine if you just absolutely cut them off after October 7th, how quickly things can deteriorate. And, the other thing is, and what we're experiencing now is many of the NGOs, whether it's, the UN or any other group that's trying to bring in supplies, like we wanted to bring in oxygen delivery materials, 70% of materials throughout, what sort of medical equipment it is, doesn't matter if you're Doctors Without Borders or you're the UN, 70% of the time it's getting rejected at the border by the Israeli authorities. And the other thing that I'll say, and that we saw get exploited during the war, though, but prior to the war, if you wanted to get out of Gaza through Egypt, you had to pay Egyptian authorities as high as, before the war, it got as high as $5,000. During this war, we had reports of people having to pay Egyptian authorities $15,000 per person just to get out. And so it doesn't matter if it's a medical emergency or if, it's fleeing for your life. These are the prohibitive ways that they trap people into the Gaza Strip, but they also made sure that the access to healthcare and the ability and the capacity of the healthcare was suppressed in a way that resulted in higher mortality rates. And so, this is something that's very well documented. A lot of reports are out on it, and it's why we call it medical apartheid. I mean, that's, really how we get at that.
With some of the highest anemia levels among children in the world, by the way. Well, if the U.S. and Israel think there's not going to be any retaliation for this in the coming years. They're dreaming. This is a very dangerous situation for the United States, in the United States, and that's one reason people in America should pay attention to this. It's not just obliterating 2.3 million people in a tiny Gaza Strip twice the size of the District of Columbia. It's going to come back to haunt us. We've been talking with Dr. Nader, Ahmad, an emergency medicine physician from Chicago, Illinois, who served at Al Nasser Hospital in Gaza on a voluntary basis in January and was blocked from re-entering Gaza for a second tour in May by Israel. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad. Thank you for your courage, and I hope your voice will be heard through the mass media in the coming months.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Ahmad, if our listeners want to help with contributions, what organization would you direct that to?
I work with Med Global. They're doing fantastic work on the ground. They're in Gaza. More than 110 physicians and nurses who are Gazans are running medical points throughout the Gaza Strip. They have a malnutrition center that they're also using to help with, obviously, the starvation that we were talking about. So I think that that's an excellent organization to contribute to, medglobal.org. Medglobal, MEDGLOBAL.org.
We've been speaking with Dr. Nader Ahmad. We will link to Med Global at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, is the president now a king above the law? The answer should be obviously no, but it might not be. We'll find out after we check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 12, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Justice Department announced last week that Boeing will plead guilty to conspiracy to defraud the FAA about the safety of the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. Families who lost loved ones in 2 Boeing crashes quickly filed an objection to the deal in federal court in Fort Worth, Texas. The families said that the plea deal with Boeing unfairly makes concessions to Boeing that other criminal defendants would never receive and fails to hold Boeing accountable for the deaths of 346 persons. As a result, the generous plea agreement rests on deceptive and offensive premises, the families wrote. The issue of whether to accept the plea agreement and Boeing's guilty plea now rests with Judge Reed O'Connor, who is overseeing the criminal matter. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Did the Supreme Court just make the Constitution unconstitutional? David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an international law expert. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, and American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you for inviting me.
Welcome indeed, Bruce. You've described the last week of this Supreme Court session that ended on July 1st, 2024, as the worst week in the history of American jurisprudence in its assault on democracy and the rule of law. Can you explain?
It's very simple. On July 1st, a Monday, the last day of the court's term, the court declared 6-3 majority in Trump versus the United States that American citizens have no rights that the president is bound to respect, that the president is immune from criminal prosecution for anything that he does while he is president, including, among other things, perhaps ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his political opponent. This is not an exaggeration. That hypothetical was raised in the dissent by Sotomayor, and it was not disputed by the majority opinion. So it is hard to imagine anything more disastrous in the history of American jurisprudence that takes us back to the days before July 4th, 1776, when the king could do no wrong. Now we have a president can do no wrong.
Now, given that, let's look at the opinion itself by Chief Justice John Roberts and his cohort of 5 other justices. Where did they find in the Constitution the basis for their declaring that the criminal law could not be used against a president, no matter what acts in his official capacity he engages in? Where did they find the constitutional basis?
They did not discover it in the Constitution's text, which is their traditional approach to constitutional interpretation. They basically summoned it into being from their own vivid imagination. There is not a single syllable in the Constitution's text that the majority pointed to justify their decision. Moreover, the other element that comes into their traditional interpretive gospel is to look at words that were, ratified by the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and interpret them according to how the contemporary Americans would have understood those terms to mean. So in this case, applying the court's ordinary interpretive canons, you would ask yourself, at the Constitutional Convention, if James Madison and George Washington and other illustrious members of the 55 who attended the Constitutional Convention were asked, hey, let's interpret and provide in the Constitution immunity for a president for criminal acts, would they said, oh, yes, that's what the Constitution means? To ask the question is to answer. Could you imagine Madison or George Washington saying, oh, yeah, the Constitution means the president can do whatever he wants to do? And so in this case, the court abandoned its customary interpretive rules to reach a result that looks like it was designed and calculated, among other things, to help President Trump and to defeat the Democrats or Mr. Biden in November. I think it also was calculated in another ulterior motive to make sure that we had a president who was a Caesar so we could bestride the world like a Colossus, president being fearless of doing anything that he wanted, taking a wrecking ball to the rule of law. And part of that comes about because if you read the opinion itself, it repeats like a soundtrack, all this urgency of having the president not reluctant at all to push the envelope over the line. Yes, well, where does that come from? There's nothing in Article 2 that says, oh, the president, we want to be really, really super aggressive. And so I go back, Ralph, they summoned this into being out of whole cloth. Didn't exist.
They did not give a single example of what a president's official conduct will be like that would violate the criminal law.
That is correct. They obviously could have said, well, if the president did X, it wouldn't be immune. They didn't give even one example. The only example they actually provided was one where the president would be immune. And that is to state that a president's decision communicating with the attorney general as to who to investigate, who to prosecute, is absolutely shielded from the law. For example, the president could ask the attorney general, go investigate and indict my political opponent, and here's $50 million. You can go retire on the French Riviera afterwards. Absolutely immune. Couldn't be prosecuted for bribery. The president could accept millions of dollars to issue a pardon. Absolutely immune, because the pardon is an express presidential power. Those are things that the court did acknowledge could happen, but with regard to where the president would lose immunity, total and complete silence. Why does that matter? We know that the case now goes back to the trial court. And so there's no guidelines for the trial court to apply. The court gave nothing more than the equivalent of, we know when it's not immune when we see it, but otherwise you try to guess what that's going to be. So there's going to be endless litigation, take us probably to 2026, 2027, because immunity decisions immediately are appealable, before we'll ever even have the possibility of a witness being called in any of these cases. That's the practical effect of the decision on this.
Well, you've called this decision by 6-3 majority, which, by the way, listeners, included the 3 nominations by Trump to make up the 6-3 majority. You've called their decision itself a violation of our Constitution. Explain.
Yeah, it's a judicial counter-revolution. I mean, it's a violation because it basically turns the Constitution into scrap of paper. It means whatever the justices want it to mean. It doesn't have to find even a single word in the Constitution to justify the opinion. However, it's even worse than Dred Scott and Sanford, where the court said, blacks have no rights. White people are bound to respect. Now we've moved to no American has a right that the president is bound to. So this is extra constitutional decision. However, we still have process here. And we've already got underway, Ralph, a proposed constitutional amendment to overrule the decision. There have been 5 previous amendments that have overruled Supreme Court decisions. I would hope this will be the 6th.
So it's very unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to reverse itself anytime soon, and it's unlikely that the Congress would successfully impeach and convict members of the Supreme Court judiciary. But it is not that far-fetched to believe that a constitutional amendment may get through because the Republicans don't want a Democratic president that is immune from criminal prosecution, and the Democrats don't want a Republican president that can do whatever they want and be immune from criminal prosecution. And that would hold true for the state legislators who have to ratify it, 3/4 of them or more, to place it in the U.S. Constitution. Is that too far-fetched? A bit of optimism here?
No, I don't know. I think that Americans, once they understand and read the opinion, they will be alarmed when they recognize they have no rights that the president is bound to respect. And it goes back, and one of the things that this court decision did was to ratify, the claims that the presidents, all of them, Republican, Democratic alike, have been making and asserting since 9/11, that they can play prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner to kill anybody on the planet, on or off a battlefield, citizen or non-citizen, on his say-so alone or her say-so alone, based upon secret, uncorroborated suspicion. And those killings are not accountable to courts, not accountable to Congress. The American people stay secret forever. Now, I think most Americans would be rather alarmed and recognize that, hey, now we have a president who can snuff us out any day, and there's no remedy. And that, I think, could motivate them to say, we need an amendment to overcome what has been the undoing of the American Revolution.
It's really a judicial coup d'etat that occurred on July 1, 2024. It's hard to fathom the belief that these 6 judges think they're going to get away with it. I mean, there is going to be all kinds of damage to all kinds of people, regardless of their political labels, and there's going to be a big pushback. Do they think they're going to get away with it? These unelected, lifetime position judges?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the only thing that even comes close to this, Ralph, is Dred Scott v. Sanford. And there, one of the dissenting justices, Benjamin Curtis from Massachusetts, quit. I don't know whether I've done that. I would hope that I would consider, if I was sitting on the court in dissent, I'd have quit. It's no longer a court of law. This was just so over the line. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will happen in the future. But I think that they may well be underestimating, how much backlash there's going to be. And they also, I feel, have been blind to the fact, I apologize, Ralph, that this is going to come back to haunt them. Under their decision, a president could arrest and detain any justice who voted away the president didn't like and say, well, we've got limitless power to decide who to investigate and who to prosecute. Now you're the target. What are they going to do? It reminds me of that old conclusion in A Man for All Seasons, when Thomas More is explaining why he'd give the devil, the benefit of the law. He said, well, what are you going to do? You cut all laws down, devil runs after you, and you turn around and you want the laws and the trees and the laws all cut down. He says, I'd give the law, the benefit of the law to the devil for my own safety's sake. I think the Supreme Court justices forgot that lesson.
Well, I can hear some of our listeners, Bruce, saying the following. Relax, Bruce. Relax, Ralph. Presidents have been violating the criminal laws for decades with total impunity, not just Trump. They start wars. They kill people overseas without any evidence. They misspend money unappropriated. In this case, Biden is violating 5, perhaps 6 federal statutes by sending weapons to Netanyahu without any conditions, such as they cannot be used offensively, they cannot be used to violate human rights, etc. And he's doing that every day, and he's violating those criminal statutes with impunity. So what's the big deal, Bruce Fein, about the Supreme Court decision?
I think, Ralph, without disputing your observations, which are spot on, life and civilization is matters of degree. It's true presidents have done terrible things in the past, but they didn't always get away with it. I remember it was around, and you, Ralph, you were there at Watergate with me. You went and sued discharge of Archibald Cox. And President Nixon said to Frost in the interview, when the president does it, it means it's not illegal. Everybody was aghast. Nixon was about ready to be indicted as a former president, which he couldn't under the current Trump ruling. for obstruction of justice in the Oval Office, talking to Haldeman and Dean and Richard Helm, CIA director. And that's why he accepted the pardon. So even though there's been lawlessness in the executive branch, it's matters of degree. Why this is different is because now it's enshrined in the Constitution in its blanket. It is going to embolden the president. Okay, now I've got open downfield running across the touchdown line. I can do anything I want because the Supreme Court has said it. Not just me. I have constitutional blessing that no one can touch me. We already have seen Mr. Trump say he's going to imprison Mark Zuckerberg if he wins the election. I mean, I think that's a serious threat. I don't think it's just made up. We know Trump is really totally sometimes deranged, especially his capacity for limitless vengeance and retaliation. And so this now gives new momentum and will embolden a president to do anything, including probably taking up Sotomayor's observation. I will use SEAL Team 6 to go kill my opponent. If he doesn't obey, he may not need to kill him, but I'll just threaten. SEAL Team 6 is going to be after you unless you shape up. That's why this is.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking with Bruce Fein, constitutional and international law specialist and practitioner, not just theory. He gets into the appellate courts in cases across a wide variety of subjects. To be continued, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with constitutional scholar Bruce Fein. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Well, that's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Dr. Thayer Ahmad and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to wrap it up here. But for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap Up. Features Francesco DeSantis, with the case you haven't heard, and an extended version of a conversation we have with Bruce Fein, again, over immunity. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Anna Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
Step up, you ought to